Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the 102nd Zoom presentation that we have recorded through the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. Our speaker today is Dr. Ralph Martin. He grew up on a farm northwest of Kitchener. He got his undergraduate and master's degrees at Carleton and his PhD at McGill. He's been through various posts in academia, and he's going to explain, I'm sure, much of the content of his recent book today, and talk to us about how we need to change agriculture to make it less harmful and adequately productive for the 21st century. So over to you, Ralph.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I just want everybody to know that you're welcome to email me or go to my website if you want to contact me that way after this talk or after today. And if you haven't had a chance to ask me something that you want to, or you want to tell me something or comment on something, I would welcome you getting in touch with me, and my email address is there, and I think you'll get these slides so you'll see it again. Now, I want to point out that we are no longer, as to paraphrase Dorothy speaking to Toto, we're not in the Holocene anymore. The Holocene was ideal. It was an epoch that was ideal for agriculture, probably the best in Earth's history. And we're now in the Anthropocene, or as Dave tried to convince me the other day, perhaps we're in the Pyrocene, because the geological record will show ash as the record. Now, I'm going to go through this talk with problems, possibilities, and then a little bit at the end on probabilities. So the basic agricultural premise has been growth. We're at 7.9 billion people now with 1.4 billion cars, close to 1 billion cats and dogs. And by 2050, we expect 9 to 10 billion people. But keep in mind that that's less than a 30% increase. And the story goes, the narrative goes, that in developing countries, average incomes will rise. We're going to consume more meat. Thus, by 2050, we should increase food production by 70 to 100%. That is a dominant narrative in agriculture at this time. With animal agricultural production, we have 1 billion cattle, 0.7 billion pigs, 26 billion chickens that require feed. And I want you to pay attention to the word feed. It's different than food. And they require feed that releases methane. And you'll notice I put a chapter on each slide here that refers to the chapter in my book where I talk about these various issues. Now, in agriculture, we have, well, in the world, we have 350,000 plant species. Almost 200,000 are flowering that have edible parts useful to humans. But as we've evolved, if we can call it that, less than 300 plant species are now used for food, and only 17 provide 90% of all human food. And of those 17, the big three, corn, rice, and wheat, make up more than 50% of all food crops. So we've really narrowed down our possibilities for agricultural crops. Smallholder farms produce 80% of the world's food supply, with only 12% of the arable land. And our dear friend Bill Gates shows up again here as having the most control of farmlands in the US. And I think it's really important to mention gender. Women grow up to 80% of India's food, but own 11% of its farmland. So they do the work and they don't have the control. And that is just inviting change, in my opinion. Now, for over 90% of our existence, humans lived in egalitarian societies. And modern inequality rose and spread with the development of agriculture. And since I've been an Aggie all my life, this last statement hurts a little bit. to know that it's agriculture that in many ways is responsible for modern inequality. And I think it's important to note too that disasters occur when hazards meet vulnerability. And we need to recognize the human-made components of hazards and vulnerabilities. And much of the vulnerability is due to inequality. And that would be where we expect the worst climate disasters. It's often where there are wars. Those are the areas where there's the most vulnerability. And of course, what we eat and how we eat affects our health. In this photo, I think it's actually quite representative of how a lot of people eat. And one of the points that really strikes me here is that many people eat while doing something else. It seems that the time of sitting down for a meal and eating and being grateful and thankful for the food we have, that time seems to have passed, and we often eat while doing something else. And there are so many aspects of unhealthy eating, but they're leading to increased healthcare costs. And I have to say something about advertisers, and I think Mike Nickerson is on today, and I thank him for his book, Life, Money, and Illusion. And I really appreciate how he outlines the power of advertising in that book. You know, Canadian children and youth spend 8 hours per day on screens and view more than 25 million food and beverage ads. And most of those are for unhealthy foods. And I really appreciate that the Heart and Stroke Foundation came out with a report a few years ago, and their conclusion was that industry should pick on someone its own age. Hear, hear. Now, Val Tarasak is at the University of Toronto, and she's done some really fascinating work on insecurity, food insecurity. So those that have marginal food insecurity, their annual healthcare costs are 23% higher. If it's a little bit higher and moderate food insecurity, then their annual healthcare costs are 49% higher than those that are food secure. And if there's severe food insecurity, the annual healthcare costs are 121% higher. And I really want to drive home the point here, and there was another article in the Globe and Mail this morning about this. Food insecurity, especially in North America and Europe, is not about lack of food. It's about poverty. And it seems to me that poverty is what needs to be addressed. Now, at the University of Guelph, I've participated in a team that looked at a wasted food audit. We found that 36% of food was not edible under normal circumstances. And that was unavoidable. The avoidable, or the mushy middle, the possibly avoidable, was about 64%, or almost 2/3 in total. So something that's avoidable it would be thrown away prior to disposal and still edible. My cultural background is Mennonite, and I saw half a stick of summer sausage, and it was all I could do not to take it out of the compost, but my students held me back. Probably good for me, good for them. And I do want to point out that in Canada now, the cost of wasting food and is about, I don't have the number here. I had it. It's $49.5 billion. Yeah, it is here. And there's they argue that over 58% is wasted, and they say 32% of this is avoidable. In our case, we said it was 53 plus 11, almost double that. I'm always skeptical of reports that indicate that that what is avoidable is so low, because even when you look at an apple core, for example, it depends on the size of the apple core. I can assure you that in the apple core that I leave, there is very little left besides a few seeds and the stem. In the apple core that I've seen some children leave, it's probably half the apple. I also know a woman in Toronto who keeps her eggshells. Most people would say that eggshells are unavoidable, but she keeps them, boils them, puts them into smoothies as a source of calcium. So the mushy middle between unavoidable and avoidable is big, and a lot of the food that people claim is unavoidable actually is avoidable. Now, another problem that we have in Ontario, at least, and this is true of most of the country, perhaps not quite as much on the prairies since they've stopped with fallow and reduced tillage, especially in those drier regions. But here in Ontario, soil organic matter levels are going down on 82% of fields. That is a travesty. 54% of fields have an erosion risk that is too high. And the gospel according to Martin, all my students know this, the gospel according to Martin is to keep your soil covered, but only 20% of cropland has very high cover. And when bare ground is pounded by rain, it erodes and loses soil organic matter. So that's the situation we're in now. And then I'd like to come to the planetary boundaries. This group of Stefan and Rockstrom and others, the first time I saw a paper was in 2009. And the two that really struck me are both associated with agriculture. One is the fact that we're losing diversity of species. Many species are going extinct. And a lot of that is related to agriculture, and the one underneath there, land system change. Too much forest is going into agriculture for monocrops. But the other one that I didn't expect at that time was phosphorus and nitrogen, or biochemical flows. We've only had nitrogen fertilizer since Fritz Haber figured out how to do this, synthesize nitrogen in the lab in 1908, and his buddy Carl Bosch ramped it up and industrialized it a few years later. So we've only had nitrogen fertilizer for a little more than 100 years, and already we have way more in the biosphere than we should have. Now, since then, the other safe operating space, or the planetary boundary that we've crossed, is the one of novel entities. And this just came out this year, and there was some concern that we were not paying as much attention as we should, but now we are definitely beyond the planetary boundary in this one as well. And the book Countdown is instructive. She's following trends, but there are risks with the chemical load that we have in the environment. And then, of course, with pesticides, they are affecting not just birds and bees, but all types of soil invertebrates, which is perhaps the bigger problem. The other planetary boundary that we have now crossed is the green water planetary boundary. So that's the percent of ice-free land on which root zone soil moisture deviates from Holocene variability. So we could count on a certain amount of water being available to plant roots, and particularly those plants that we rely on for food and sustenance. But we're now away from the Holocene. We're not in the Holocene anymore. We're now in the Anthropocene epoch, and we can't rely. There's either too much or too little water at the wrong time. And I want to point out, going back to climate, that cuts in global emissions planned by 2030 are way off track to keep below 1.5. This paper in Nature estimates that we have a less than 10% probability of getting to 1.5 at this point. And then in this paper from a year or so ago, they talk about where we're at most risk if we do have high emission scenarios. And it's right through here, Africa, and we're already seeing a lot of drought, and it's been sustained drought in East Africa for quite a while. It would go through India and China. These are some of the areas with the highest population, and they're most at risk if we go beyond the safe climate space. And this paper, again, by Stefan and Rockstrom and others that have looked at the planetary boundaries, talk about how we have planet Earth, where we want it is in the stable pathway here in the middle. Prior to the Holocene, it would wobble over into the glacial areas or the interglacial areas, and in there, they would, planet Earth was getting cool and often too cool for adequate plant growth. But now that we're coming out of the Holocene, we've wobbled over to the right side, to the trough on the right. And this is what they call the hothouse Earth pathway. And they talk about, I know this is just an image, but they're talking about how we're falling down deeper into the trough as we get closer to about a two degree change from pre-industrialization. And somewhere in there is the planetary threshold when we get into the hothouse Earth pathway, and it will be too late to get back over to stabilized Earth. And this could have profound implications for agriculture. Mostly that there will be too much or too little water at the wrong time, or the temperatures will be too high or too low at the wrong time. It will be about extremes. So a recent graph of the planetary boundaries was put out by the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Potsdam Institute. So we have our extinction problem here. We still have the biochemical flows, novel entities, as we mentioned, the green water. Now they are being much more definitive about climate being beyond the safe operating space. In 2009, they said there was too much uncertainty to say for sure. Now they're saying they're quite a bit more certain. And land system change is a huge problem. This is where forests are cut to grow monocrops, often soybean or corn, two of the three big crops. Now I'd like to go into possibilities. We could reimagine the premise of growth. One, I think, would be improved education for girls and women. We've known then since the UN Cairo conference in 1990, and the more that girls and women are educated, the less likely they are to have large families. We could reduce wasted food. Now it's more than 50% in Canada. And we could eat less meat. And the meat could be of higher quality, more pulses, beans, peas, lentils, and so on. And I think there's a real opportunity for edible insects, and there are some insect farms. Some of them are growing insects to eat directly. Sometimes the insects are used to harvest otherwise inedible organic material, and then they take advantage of the conversion process and they feed the insects to chickens. And I think the big thing in terms of possibilities is to consume less. It was in, I think about 2000 that overconsumption surpassed overpopulation as the greatest driver. And a lot of people talk about increasing population, and yes, that is a problem, but consumption per person is really a bigger problem. The average person in a rich country now consumes 13 times as much as the average person in a poor country. And we've often heard that we would need 3 or 4 Earths if everyone lived like an average Canadian. Oops. There we go. Now, coming to animal agriculture, I want to be clear right off the bat that I'm not an advocate of removing all animal agriculture. I think there is some real value in animals. I look at animals as a battery of nutrients. And we did a study some time ago with a couple students, I guess just 2 years ago. And we were looking at maximizing forages as feed. So forages are Timothy clover and so on. And these grasses and legumes are ideal for building soil organic matter and improving soil quality. It's one of the reasons why the prairies had such high soil organic matter, because they were growing grasses and legumes, and the buffalo were grazing it, often in a rotational manner. And instead of a fence, they had predators that kept them moving from one site to another. And in the paper, we said it's really important to integrate crop and livestock systems so that you have the livestock manure and you can use any products, including forages, that are feed, that is only suitable for livestock consumption and not food. And there's a huge opportunity, especially around GTA in Ontario, where I am. There's a big circle of about 100 kilometers around GTA, where there are all kinds of co-products associated with food processing. And these are unavoidably wasted food, but we could use them for feed. And there's a program in the Netherlands where they have really finessed this system of using co-products for feed. Ontario could reduce arable land for feed production by 40%. That would provide an awful lot of land to grow food crops, which we may well need in the future, while maintaining sufficient animal protein for an adequate diet. And that sufficient animal protein is according to the Canada Food Guide. There are some that argue it wouldn't have to be that high. With biodiversity, it's really important to grow diverse crop species. And here's my colleague, Yuvan Zheng. He has a bitter melon there, and that's a crop that Asians really like. We were using high tunnels. In other words, there was no energy input, but it extended the season at the beginning and at the end, and we were able to grow these organically in Ontario. And there's a really good market for that. These are some of the opportunities I think we should take advantage of. And I would really see a policy opportunity here. I am also a member of the Green Party. I've been canvassing for the last few days, so my head has been there, and I'm coming back to this right now. I should say, by the way, that if any of you ever have a problem with an inflated ego, go canvassing for a while. It's a great way to bring your ego down to size. And I know I was at a door some time ago and somebody said to me, "Ralph Martin, I remember you. You had signs out when you ran and I stole one of your signs. My last name is Martin too." And I said, "Oh." And he said, "The reason I stole the sign was because my dog's name is Ralph. So I put the sign Ralph Martin on my Beagle's doghouse. And well, there you go. That's also a good use of a political sign." But coming back to, I've encouraged the Green Party to adopt a policy of paying incentive payments to farmers to reserve at least 3% of natural habitat per farm. This is at least. I would like to see it higher than that. 7–10% would be much better. And then to improve natural habitat. And there are some farmers who are doing some very creative things. There's a farmer I know down in Norfolk County who is now looking at silviculture or silvopasture. And it's almost like an oak savanna that the original indigenous inhabitants had there. And they're grazing sheep under these, in this silvopasture system, keeps them cooler in the summertime, keeps them protected in the winter, and gives all kinds of opportunity for tree growth, carbon sequestration, but still the grass growth. In Africa, there's a wonderful organization called the African Orphan Crops Consortium. And their goal is to keep Africa healthy through nutritious, diverse, and local food crops. The Bill Gates approach is to take a few very productive crops like maize or rice and manipulate them to make them a little bit more nutritious. In the African Orphan Crops Consortium, they have about 100 to 150 crops that they're working with. They know they're well adapted to Africa. They know that they have high nutritional value. And what they want to do is make each of these crops just a little bit more productive. And that seems to be a very good approach. Now, going back again to the issue of poverty and food insecurity. Most food insecure households do not use food banks. And there is no evidence that food charity is a durable solution. You know, governments need to act on food insecurity through income-based intervention. And this comes back to my colleague Val Tarasuk at University of Toronto. And a lot of people recommend a guaranteed annual income. These two, Roos and Forget, came out with a report a few years ago. Now, they did this through the Fraser Institute, which I would not describe as a flaming left-wing organization. And they argued that a guaranteed annual income would cost about $17 billion. A luxury guaranteed annual income would cost about $58 billion. That was in those dollars at that time. And the total cost of Canada's current income support system is about 185. Now, some of that current, you couldn't replace it all with a guaranteed annual income. There are some plans for people on disability and so on that would still have to continue. But it seems to me that we'd have lots of room to move within that 185 billion. And a guaranteed annual income can support low-end consumers and farmers. There are so many struggling farmers, particularly small farmers, that are providing food directly to people in towns and cities. And sometimes they need support too. If they pay their workers a fair wage, some of them have nothing left for themselves. And a book that I highly recommend is by Hugh Siegel. It's called Bootstraps Need Boots. And Hugh was a conservative. He's now at University of Toronto, Massey College, but he's been arguing for a guaranteed annual income for a long time. The other thing that I think is really important is to have more food skills and food literacy. And every time I mention this to people in school boards or principals, they say, oh, but the problem is we have so much to teach, we just can't add anything more. My argument is that you can teach math much better by linking it to food skills and food literacy. You can teach science better by linking it to food skills and food literacy. Even history can be taught better by linking it to food skills and food literacy. So reducing wasted food. We could feed 1 billion extra people if we just use the best current methods. This is not inventing something new, just going with what we know. And this comes back to my previous slide about food awareness and food skills. When we did our study at the University of Guelph, we went and we actually went through people's compostable garbage at the curb. We were wearing masks long before COVID as we were doing this. And we were separating it into avoidable and unavoidable and different categories. And then we went back and surveyed people about their attitudes and so on. They didn't necessarily know that we already had data from how much they had actually wasted. And the point that really stood out to me was that people with more food awareness waste less food. So the food awareness might be someone in the family with a food allergy. It might be that they garden. It might be that they do a lot of cooking. Whatever it takes to bring food awareness relates to less wasted food. Now, the principles of addressing wasted food are, number one, reduce, reduce, reduce. There are just so many ways that we can reduce wasting food in the first place. I remember as a young student just coming off the farm and going to Carleton University, and in the cafeteria, a food fight broke out, and I was sick. I just had to leave. I could hardly go back into that cafeteria for days afterward. It was just so horrific to me to see food used so disrespectfully. The second point, if for some reason food waste cannot be reduced, is to recover and then upscale it. And there's some really interesting companies now that are developing ways of purifying food and putting it into smoothies and so on, so that they can take what was otherwise wasted food and upscaling it. If that's not possible, it could be fed to pets, livestock, including insects. And if that's not possible, then I would go for anaerobic digestion, and more farms have anaerobic digesters now. That way you can capture both the energy and the nutrients. Or the next choice would be biodiesel for energy or compost for nutrients. And diverting from landfill is what you do after all else, but that is not the goal, to divert from landfill. The goal is to reduce, and use these other opportunities if you cannot reduce it further. Now, coming back to inequality, in this wonderful book, The Spirit Level, they point out that jurisdictions with more equal income distributions have better mental and physical health of their citizens for everyone, and not just those who have less. And it's fascinating to me with the Davis conference going on, that millionaires there, and like, you know, there's the Disney heiress who has been calling to be taxed more, but there are more and more who are recognizing that it shouldn't be up to exceptionally wealthy people to decide how they want to give away their money to the people they select, often still for their own advantage. They should be taxed, and that would help to bring some kind of common sense back to equality. Now with farmland, we need it, and given that I'm in Ontario and canvassing for the Greens right now, I am very aware that Doug Ford intends to build Highway 413 and the Bradford Highway. They would cost about over $10 billion. There are so many things we could do with that $10 billion that not for building highways. This is going to pave over another couple thousand acres of farmland. The thing about prime, or I like to call it dependable agricultural land, is that that is what we are going to need as the climate changes. As we get more variability, or too much moisture or too little moisture at the wrong time, or temperatures that are too high or too low at the wrong time, our best chance of getting sessile plants to make it through to a yield is going to be on prime land, class 1, 2, or 3. Many constraints on the other classes. It's also important to preserve wetlands and prime ag land, regardless of location in Ontario. And the two biggest farm organizations in Ontario have now supported this. They are the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario. Now, another policy that I would like to see, and I've asked the Green Party to adopt this, and they have, would be to advance food security and carbon dioxide drawdown with financial incentives to maintain or increase outcomes. And it's the outcomes of soil organic matter levels in agricultural fields that we would measure. And I foresee that we would measure soil organic matter levels in every field every 5 years. And this is quite possible. I've checked the numbers of soil test samples that are coming into labs now. And if we measured for soil organic matter level in every field every 5 years, and it would have to be according to a consistent scientific protocol. The farmer couldn't do it himself or herself. There might be too much temptation to pick the spots that they know are really good. It would have to be done by a certified crop advisor. But I think if we did this and we measured the outcome, and it's important to measure it over time because there's active carbon and there's more stable carbon. And the active carbon may wobble up and down a bit, but if you measure every 5 years and you can start to see trends, that's exactly what we need. Farmers know what they have to do. There's a lot of information now, and it's not just down to one best practice like no-till. It includes growing forages, making sure the field is covered, minimal tillage, all of that. This is just a graph from a paper that we published recently about service crops. Some people call them cover crops. Service crops do more than provide cover. They provide pollinator habitat and so on. And there's a risk with service crops, and a lot of farmers are worried about the transpirational water loss, but you can increase the crop water supply. And in almost all cases, there's a net benefit to crop water supply. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of reducing our dependency on nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. Legumes, you see a photo here at the top right of nodules on a legume root. They can, with bacteria, can capture nitrogen from the air, break apart the N2 molecule, attach hydrogen, and then you get ammonia and for plant uptake, ammonium. Organic farming does not use synthesized nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. There are crops that enhance phosphorus availability, like lupins. And it's really, really important to feed livestock feed, not food. There's so much emphasis now on getting as much production per animal as possible that sometimes the quality of the feed merges on food quality. And there are the 4 R's of fertilizer application: the right source, the right place, the right time, the right amount. And of course, reducing waste of food. And then we can utilize municipal solid waste, manure, and sewage. Now, in wastewater management, ozonation helps to remove contaminants like pharmaceuticals and pesticides. I think we need much more research on this if we're going to be looking at sewage. And there must be ways to manage pathogens, pharmaceuticals, plastic, chemicals, all of the things that are in sewage. We have to find a way to deal with this, and whether it's source separating urine and feces, maybe it means that all new homes will have compost toilets and will collect every 6 months. I'm not sure what we're going to have to do, but I think putting all our sewage all together in big pipes and transporting them around with water and not treating it very well is not the way to manage this ideal resource. Now, there was a paper that came out just a little while ago about Canada and the Fertilizer Canada, which represents all the fertilizer companies, claims that if we have to reduce fertilizer, then yields are going to drop way down. This report pointed out that a 20% reduction in fertilizer use on average results in a crop yield reduction of only less than 5%. And there can be cost savings to farmers from reduced input costs. And farmers may adjust cropping systems with less high nitrogen feeding crops, more legume cover crops, split application of nitrogen, nitrification inhibitors, and so on. And there are opportunities for reducing pesticides. This study is so fascinating to me. They had children that were 2 to 4, and somehow they collected their urine. I don't know how they did that, but they did. And some of them were on an organic diet, but they could only find kids on an organic diet that had about 80% organic. They couldn't find enough children with a 100% organic diet. And they contrasted those with children that were on a non-organic diet. And the concentrations of organophosphate metabolites were 9 times lower in the urine of children on an organic diet. Now, this spider graph is from a paper of some of my colleagues in Europe, and they were looking at the question of how feasible would it be for organic agriculture to feed the world? And of course, most people say, oh, that would just be impossible. And maybe it would be, but they looked at a number of categories like land use, pesticides, and nitrogen, and so on. So of course, with the pesticides, organic, the yellow is low, like synthetic pesticides are not used in organic agriculture. The N balance was actually too low. There wasn't enough N, it was below 0, and that would create a problem in the system. But on most of the other categories, it was pretty close. Now, land use was a little bit higher under an impact of climate change scenario. Not that much higher, but a little bit higher. And this whole scenario was based on the assumption that first, wasted food would be reduced by half, and that animals would eat only feed, no food grade feed, only feed. And they also said that they could get an N balance if organic was at 80% rather than 100%, then they could get their nitrogen balance. That would pull down land use a little bit as well, and it would pull in deforestation. So this with an N balance so that organic was 80% or maybe even 50% would have much more possibility than here at where organic is 100%. One of the things I often think about is when we want to balance production and consumption, what if mainstream agriculture had evolved differently and we produced high quality food with yields about 25% lower than now? That's where we are with organic. This paper by Sofert and Ramankutty from UBC, it's a study of organic systems across the world. And on average, organic yields are 20 to 25% lower. Now, in that same scenario, if that's what mainstream agriculture was, and wasted food was 15% and not greater than 40% as it is now, some people say it's 50, but let's say it's 15 instead of 40, would we aspire to produce 25% more food so that we could waste 40% or more? I don't think so. Now, I want to just say a little bit about probabilities. And here I'm not a social scientist. My undergrad is in philosophy, but I'm starting to get a little bit outside my area of expertise. But I think it is important to remember that we are children of Mother Earth. We are made of stardust. We've inherited this 4.5 billion year reverie of grace. And now we have this wonderful opportunity as self-aware creatures to look back on the whole story. It's only been in the last few decades we've been able to do this. And are we going to choose to continue to be participants, or are we going to write ourselves out of the story? And of course, the Svalbard Global Seed Bank is one that's of real interest to me. We could say it's getting ready for doomsday, or that we're being prudent and seeing our way through, as we did in Syria when they lost some genotypes because of the war. They went to Svalbard and were able to recover them. I often think that Earth systems, or Mother Earth, provided a really good, gentle reminder for us with the pandemic. It's an opportunity to be more motivated to appropriately adapt. Now, there are some risks of pessimism and optimism. I think excess pessimism could sabotage appropriate action. And similarly with excess optimism, although I've been to a few CACOR meetings, and my experience is that we don't have too many excess optimists in this group. And Gandhi said, whatever you do will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. And I want to go to a wise woman, Joanna Macy. She argued that of all the dangers we face, from climate chaos to nuclear war, none is so great as the deadening of our response. So if we are going to improve the probabilities for acting on some of the possibilities, we dare not deaden our response. And she talks about a four-step system of first having gratitude for being here at this time in Mother Earth, at this point in the long story. She argues that we should honor our pain, because we all do have quite a bit of pain with what's happened to us and to people we know, and then seeing with new eyes and then going forth. And that would be with action. And I think it's really important to sort wants from needs to live well within planetary boundaries. And of course, Pierre Doncereau is one that I really respect. And he too talks about curbing appetites, consuming less, and being happily frugal. And I just love that term, being happily frugal. So this is my last slide. I'm here on the ancestral lands of the Arawandran, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So far, settlers have lived in this land for centuries. My ancestors came here about 2 centuries ago. But it's important to remember that Indigenous people have lived here in relationships, including a very self-awareness of a relationship with Earth and Earth systems. And they've done this for millennia. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. Okay, well, that concludes my slides. So I'm quite happy to take any comments or questions.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Martin. I'm going to start off actually with a couple of questions. I've got Art Hunter on deck. Not so many questions after that. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat. So I'd like to start with this one. Do you think that we have enough agricultural capacity around the globe to draw down all the carbon that we've injected into the atmosphere and the oceans in the last 200 years? Relatedly, will the oceans off gas if we reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere? And related to that, there's something I want to note about fermentation before I get to my second question.
Okay.
So looking at, can we draw down the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere?
I don't know, like just as a possibility, assuming that all farmers were willing to do what we need to do. I have one colleague who calculated that it probably could be done, but that's based on the assumption that all farmers would do what they need to do to manage their soil to actually keep building soil organic carbon or soil organic matter. And we also have to work with the fact that at some point soils will reach a plateau. Like it's not a linear increase forever. It goes up and then it tends to plateau. So for a number of years, if everybody did what they should do, and if following the French example, like in France, they have a policy of 4 per 1,000. They're setting up programs and incentivizing farmers to build their soil organic matter by 4 parts per 1,000 every year, like an increase of 4 per 1,000 every year. And I think they argue that they can deal with their own emissions if they do that. So far, I don't think they've managed to do it across the country. So it seems to me we should not rely on agriculture to suck up all that carbon. The second part of your question about the oceans off-gassing, I don't know, but it seems like a reasonable hypothesis that might. I don't know enough about oceans, but it seems to me like it's a reasonable hypothesis.
Well, surely the oceans have got some kind of equilibrium that gets established on a seasonal basis with the atmosphere. So I suspect that could happen. With respect to what's going on in France, they may well be able to offset their current emissions, which would, if we could hold everything constant, we wouldn't get an increase. If everybody did what they're doing, we wouldn't get an increase in atmospheric carbon. But we have 200 years worth of atmospheric carbon that we've already put up. So the job is not just to reduce, offset what we currently have, but also to draw down what we put into the atmosphere before.
Understood. And we should not rely on agriculture to do that.
By the way, I don't think we can rely on forestry either.
No.
So to go on to my second question, do you really think that we can feed not just the 8 billion people we have now, but another billion people on top of that? And in fact, does that not just seal us into the kind of current ecosystem destruction that we've undertaken, especially in the last century?
Well, I can't do anything about the fact that we've got 8 billion people and that we'll probably peak at around 9.4 somewhere in 2060, and then come back down again, and that consumption's so high. I mean, that's the world as it is right now. So when I talked about organic agriculture meeting that challenge, it's in contrast to the sticking to our current path, which is a lot more destructive. So in that paper, we were looking at reducing wasted food by half and making sure that we fed only feed to livestock. And it looked like it was contrasting reasonably well with the current path that we're on. I would like to see us do much better than that. I'd like to see wasted food come down further. I think that we could bring our livestock numbers down a lot. You know, I think there is a role for livestock, as I mentioned, because they're a battery of nutrients and they can eat forages and so on. They can eat co-products. There are ways that we can conserve nutrients with livestock, but we really need to reduce our livestock numbers so that we're using them in the way that I think they were originally intentioned. 100 years ago, nobody would have thought of feeding food to livestock. And 100 years from now, it's not going to happen. We're in this unusual bubble in time where we've got this silly economics where it makes sense to feed such high quality feed that it's almost food.
So one quick follow-up to this, do you think that controlled fermentation might be able to add to our ability to produce food either for humans or for animals?
Yes, it's possible. I'm not a microbiologist and I don't know enough about it, but I keep reading reports, and I think there are some really fascinating possibilities there. But I have to admit that that's outside my pay bracket.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Art Hunter, and John Mayer, you're next.
Yeah, Ralph, I'm really interested in your comment with regards to food awareness and how this helps reduce waste. Now, I'm drawing parallels with what goes on in the home consumption of energy, which I'm much more comfortable discussing, because before I started my microgrid project, I was wasting enormous amounts of energy, and I was not aware of it. It wasn't until such time as I started having the ability to measure, you know, leads up to that statement that says you can't manage what you can't measure. But as soon as I was aware, then I could start doing conservation and reduce waste. Now, some of the things which have been around for some time, and some of them are starting to grow and gain a little more traction. Of course, the world of community gardens has been there since for the last 20, 30 years. Vertical farming has been talked about a fair bit, and there's some big undertakings that are doing exactly that to reduce the distance from plant to plate and all that, as well as what's happening now is this winter greenhousing using geothermal energy, and I get people talking to me about how we can enhance the geothermal energy portion of it. But my question to you is this, are these types of community gardens and vertical farming and winter greenhouses and others. Is that making any substantive difference in the other than hopefully energy awareness goes up if you're doing this, or at least food awareness goes up if you're doing this. But do you see any substantive change to food security through using these techniques?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure if it's been substantial yet, but there are more and more people now that are involved in community supported agriculture, or CSAs, and those people have a real awareness of what the farmer is doing. And CSAs were originally developed in Japan just after the Second World War. It was a TAI-K model, they called it, and there were housewives who wanted healthy food, and they went to farmers and said, this is the kind of food we want you to grow for us. And the farmers said, okay, we will, but we want you to take on some of the risk with us if we do this. And so the housewives paid the farmers up front for a subscription of food. And then CSAs have taken off, but there are rooftop gardens, there are community gardens. I think all of these are very good for increasing awareness. And anybody who does that tends to waste less food because they're more aware of how difficult it is to grow it. I think there's huge potential. Now, I have to keep in mind that gardens and greenhouses and so on usually grow, salad crops and things like that, vegetables that are important. A lot of our calories are still going to come from cereals, and I think it's appropriate that we're still growing some cereals and crops like soybean and common bean and so on that can provide some of the protein and the carbohydrates that we need. But every little bit helps. And from my point of view, I think it's just wonderful that more and more people are doing it. There's a group in Vancouver, a group of young students, and I think there's also a group in Toronto. And what they do is they go to people in the city and they say, we see that you have a garden or a few fruit trees. Here's the deal. We'll manage your garden. We'll harvest the fruit. You can have a third, and then we'll keep 2/3 to run our business. And that has been really popular. The homeowners love it because they like to see their land being well used, and it creates awareness for a lot of people.
Great. Thank you. That's excellent.
Okay, we're going to go over to John Mayer, and Peter Mckinnon, you're on deck.
Yeah, Ralph, thanks very much. Since we're talking about agriculture and soil, I wanted to throw in a plug for my favorite study that opened my eyes decades ago, and that was the Loudermilk study done in the 1930s called Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's wonderful. And it outlines the degradation through our civilized past of the land through our activities. And I'm wondering, as this degradation continues, do you think that the technology that we're applying will be able to run ahead of further degradation brought about by climate change?
Well, like it comes into the category of possibilities for me. I think that there are things that we could do if we choose to do them. And with technology, one of the opportunities that I see is that as we get into autonomous tractors and autonomous vehicles and farms, we can start decreasing machinery size. Up till now, tractors and combines and machines have increased in size so that one person can cover more acres per day. But if that one person is in her pickup truck or farm office and operating 10 autonomous vehicles at once, it introduces opportunities to have irregular boundaries, and we could have more diversity in the landscape. And these machines aren't going to mind making the little turns. You can outline the field and optimize the trajectory so that they overlap just enough, but not too much. And I think, and those technologies, like right now with weeders, there are robots that are weeding now. They're not necessarily tilling. They're able to pluck small weeds or punch them in. And these robots can work 24/7, except when some of them are electric and they might have to be recharged. But other than that, they just keep working and they keep going through the fields. And I think there are many opportunities there. And then with integrating forages into systems and trees and silvopasture and agro-silvopasture and so on, I think getting these kinds of dynamics into the system would work really well. My PhD, my master's and PhD was on intercropping, and there are so many biological advantages to intercropping, but I kept being told that I wasn't practical because we didn't have the machinery to work with it. And my assertion then, and still is that we need to get the biology right first. And there are all kinds of smart engineers around, and then they can build the machines to work with the biological systems that can optimize ecosystem health on farms. And I still think that there are opportunities to do that. And now the technology is way ahead of what it was when I was a PhD student.
Right. Okay. Thanks. One short follow-up. The severity, the cycles, typical cycle of climate change is more severe drought, more severe rainfall. Is that cycle, more extreme cycle, is that leading to greater soil erosion?
Well, it can certainly when there's too much water within a short period of time on soil that is not covered. That's why it's becoming more and more important to follow the gospel according to Martin and keep your soil covered. Because when we get that heavy rainfall, you need to have plants that are absorbing the impact of those raindrops.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
Ralph, I'll bet you've seen the old Senate report, Soil at Risk from the 70s. One of my favorite
I sure
books.
have.
Yeah, one of my favorite books. There's a great picture in there of what you would think is the Dust Bowl, and it's from the 1970s in Alberta.
I met Senator Hubert Sparrow. I invited him to come out to Nova Scotia to speak. And once he was on the stage, I was responsible for getting him to the airport in time, and I couldn't get him off the stage. He wouldn't stop talking, and the audience was fully engaged, and they were asking. And finally, I took him by the arm and said, if I'm going to get you to your plane, you have to come now.
Cool. Okay. We're going to go over to Peter Mckinnon, followed by Ray Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for your presentation. My video's not on.
Okay.
I had a question. I didn't hear you speaking at all about the circular economy, in that, at least using those words in the context of agriculture. And I'm just wondering if you might comment about the role of circular economy in agriculture and in the sort of locavore kind of setting that you were sort of describing in your 100-kilometer zone around the greater Metro Toronto area.
Right. Well, I did talk about the circular economy, but I didn't mention that word. I think the biggest contribution we could make to a circular economy is to learn how to use nutrients and sewage and perhaps the carbon. And somehow, and I know, like, I work in the organic ag sector, and I know that my colleagues in organic agriculture don't want sewage to be included, and that's like spreading biosolids as they are. But I think we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that. We know about struvite, like we can extract struvite, a phosphorus source, from sewage, and there are other things we have to do. And I think that's the ultimate circular economy, if you will. We have to get those nutrients from people, from the sewage, and we have to find out how to do it while dealing with chemicals and pathogens and pharmaceuticals and plastics. And this is one of the technological challenges facing us now, but we really need to find a way to do it. And yes, and I think that would be within range of cities, because you wouldn't want to transport it too far. Although if you have something like struvite, you've extracted it. It comes in a pellet. It looks a little bit like fertilizer. So you can transport that, but I would like to see it within a close region. I was in Cuba in 1997, and that was just at the end of the special period. And the Cubans had organoponicos, or they had gardens in the city, and they built these big cement raised beds where they were growing all kinds of vegetables and so on. One of the big limitations was to get organic carbon input, and so they would try to get that from the countryside, from from palm trees and so on, and leaves that had fallen. And all their horses had bags at the back end to catch manure that went into the organoponicos as well. So yes, I think there are opportunities there, but I think the biggest one is with sewage.
Can you comment, are there any Canadian communities, sort of agricultural towns perhaps, or otherwise, that have embraced any of this sort of way of thinking?
Well, Guelph has a big project they're calling the circular economy. And I've talked to the folks involved in that a few times, but so far they're not talking about sewage. And I would like them to.
Thank you very much.
Related to sewage, I know one of the things that we have to make sure we do is not put stuff on farm fields that hasn't been adequately processed, so that we've killed off the pathogens, and so that we get rid of the terrible smell that sometimes is accompanied by spreading that stuff.
Absolutely agree. We have to deal with the pathogens, pharmaceuticals, plastics, we have to find a way to deal with all of that. And it seems to me that there must be a way to do it. That's a challenge.
A lot of people are working on it. I know that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go over to Ray Desjardins, followed by Mary Hegan.
Thank you very much, Doug. I really enjoyed your talk, Ralph. Two areas that I'm sort of involved these days. We just published a paper on a greenhouse gas protein ratio, and it shows the range of CO2 equivalent emitted per unit protein, which it will just be published in the next few weeks.
I would love to see
it's quite
that.
relevant to what you're talking about. We're promoting this as an indicator to see how things are moving with time, and it relates to what you were talking. And I'm also promoting another indicator, which is solar radiation management. How the albedo change, and it again that goes along what you're talking of cover crops and all this. So it fits very well with what you're talking about.
I would love to see that paper, Ray.
Yeah.
If you could send it to me, or if I get your
right
email.
away.
Yeah, that'd be great. I don't know if you remember back when I was a PhD student, I came to your office and I was talking to you a couple of times.
Yeah.
I really appreciated your work ever since, and it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you, Ralph. Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Okay, over to Mary Hegan, followed by Ted Manning.
Hi, Ralph. It's Mary from rural Ottawa. And
Yes.
this has been a refreshing discussion and a nice break from out there campaigning on a provincial election. It sort of inspires one again. So thank you very much. I put two questions in the chat. My first question relates quite closely to the one that Art Hunter has already asked you. So I'm going first of all to my second question. And it's around the issue that is starting to emerge in the city of Ottawa and their land uses. But maybe I think across the province actually. And it is the pros and cons of people wanting to now have regulations to support them to naturalize their front and backyards. And some of this is towards growing food. And to me, it also means going to classes and discussions about the value of growing food. So all the knowledge-based stuff. But they don't have much background information if that's a good way for the municipality to go. Because right now, people, their neighbors can complain and everything stops. So there's not the support at the municipal level to start using your land that way. What's your experience on that front?
Well, it starts with a wonderful article I read one time where God is talking to someone who's trying to convince God that lawns are a good idea. And God said, now let me get this straight. I gave you these biodiverse habitats and you're replacing it with just one species in many cases. And then you put on excess fertility. So you have to do a whole lot of work to keep mowing it every couple of weeks. And you're trying to tell me that that's an improvement over the habitat that I gave you. And it's a wonderful article. But yes, I'm in favor of using backyards and front yards for food production, provided that people are managing it appropriately. It can provide pollinator habitat. I would very much want the soil to be covered all the time. So you can, just as it's important to have cover crops in a big field, I think it's important to do that in a garden or to have mulches, but there are opportunities for that. It takes some awareness. You might attract some rodents and you might have to know how to deal with all that and how to appropriately manage compost. But I think of the Victory Gardens, and I think it's going to be a no-brainer, like it is to me now, but I think in the future, a lot of people are going to really want to have that.
I think what we do need is people who think it's a great idea on the surface, but they haven't got the background to build a big case to go to their counselors and city council to get the support they need. And so if there are studies or layman language type of support ideas, I think there's a group of us that would use that material to try to build a responsible case.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm finding it's fairly new for people to push back when they are stopped by others from doing this. And I think it's a new idea for a lot of people. So it's a matter of getting aware and used to that sort of thing.
There was a master's student at the University of Guelph who did a study on Ottawa about using land appropriately for agriculture in the city. I'll try to find that. And if you send me an email, then I'll give you the information about that thesis. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Sure.
Who
that would be wonderful.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, I have another question, but I'll leave space for other people to ask things first.
Okay, we'll see if we can come back to you, Mary. For everybody else, I have enough questions in the queue now that I think we'll cut off new questions into the chat. So Ted Manning, and then followed by Jean Doherty.
Hi, Ralph. Ted Manning here. I was head of land use planning for Environment in Canada for quite some time. Well, then, and we didn't fix anything. But I'm coming from it. I missed the first part of your talk, so if you've covered this, please excuse me. I'm looking at the whole notion of food waste and the idea of really how can we manage food waste effectively. But the problem is it is so culturally related and it's so different in different countries that in much of the world, the food waste is due to lack of storage, lack of planning, lack of procurement systems, lack of ways to transport it, all of the above. Whereas here, I think it's quite different, that it's really conspicuous consumption, overbuying, trying to hoard, and chucking and buying more than we can eat and then throwing it away and not even considering what we do with it. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. I did talk some about wasted food, and I prefer to call it wasted food, with food being the noun and wasted being the adjective, because this is not just any ordinary waste that happens to be food. This is food and it's wasted anyway. Excuse the lecture. But yes, I think it's very important. And yes, in North America, Europe, most of the waste is in households, quite a bit in restaurants, cafeterias, and so on, all you can eat, and so on. In those situations, there's way too much of it. this is something I'm a little bit reluctant to say too loudly, but here goes, I will say it. I think that as the price of food goes up, which it is right now, that will be a good thing. And I think people will take food a little bit more seriously. One of the things we found in our study when we looked at wasted food was that people treat it almost like entertainment. Like they make sure their fridge is full for at least the next week. And then somebody on the spur of the moment invites them out to supper, and they go out to supper and they have too much in their fridge, and they waste some in the restaurant and they waste some at home. As food gets more and more expensive, in North America, we're still spending about 10% of our disposable income on food. When it gets to 20 or 30%, we'll be a bit more respectful. Now, I understand that there are people for like an increase is just going to be really a huge issue. But as I mentioned in the talk, it's not lack of food that is the issue, it's poverty. And it seems to me that we must directly address poverty. As the price of food goes up, I think people will waste less. And as I mentioned in the talk, awareness. The more that people are aware of food issues and they have food literacy and food skills, the less they waste. So I think all of those go together. And there's a wonderful example from a restaurant in Guelph where some of my colleagues went in and they noticed that they were peeling potatoes very enthusiastically to the point where they were losing a third of every potato. And they pointed this out to the restaurant. It goes back to the comment that somebody said about measuring. So once the restaurant knew this, they decided that after that, they would just scrub the potatoes a little bit, and they sold rustic mashed potatoes, and the customers loved it. And they wasted much less, and everybody was happier, and the potatoes were actually healthier.
Try and get that sold to Costco.
Say that.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to go over to Jean Doherty, followed by Paul Beckwith, and Anitra Thorog from CACOR, USA Club of Rome, is going to give us a final comment before we wrap up the session.
Thank you, Ralph. That was a really interesting presentation, and I was intrigued by your discussion or your talking about, I think they're called Class A soils or agricultural lands, and the fact that a lot of those are now being covered up in Canada, in particular by urban. And I'm assuming that a Class A soil is defined by its precipitation, when and where it happens, its soil chemistry, organic content, etc. And if those Class A farmlands are actually going to be altered or moved with climate change?
Well, we have 7 classes of land, class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Class 1 just means that there are essentially no limitations to growing food. Okay. Class 2, there might be a few. By the time you get down to class 7, it's pretty much rock. But so the land that is class 1 or 2 or 3, that's prime ag land. And those categories are really what we need in situations of climate change, because they are more likely to sustain plant growth even under conditions of too much or too little moisture, temperatures too high or too low. So to me, it just seems a travesty that we would pave over class 1, 2, or 3 land. We are going to really need it. And as the climate situation worsens. In Ontario, we may be a bit luckier than they will be in East Africa and so on. I think in the future, like, you know, the ag policy in Canada has been driven by exports, but we're not going to need to flog our exports in a few years. We'll be able to sell whatever we want. And we need to maintain our prime land to be able to grow through unusual conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so over to Paul Beckwith, and Anitra is on deck. Paul, are you there? I've been trying to get him started. Okay, I'll come back to Paul in a minute if I can. So Anitra, go ahead. We'll come back to you, Paul.
Okay, fine. Thank you. we had the meeting on the celebration of 50th anniversary of Limits to Growth in Boston at MIT, where the action happened. Limits to Growth was written by Donella Meadows. And I think we should all be very happy that our glorious leader, the transitional and transformative Rimpella, joined us specifically for the entire day. And she was very dynamic and very, very engaged with the relationship between the International Club and the 4 associations, all of whom were represented here in the Western Hemisphere, the Canadian Club of Rome, the USA, the Mexican, and the Argentine. And Dennis Meadows addressed us on how the Limits to Growth was actually created and the different decision maker points that had to be decided to make the entire model and make the scenarios. And he was very generous in his time. And then we had 10 people. Unfortunately, our beloved colleague, Rob Hoffman, was to give one of the assessments of Limits to Growth, but he didn't, so that Jean and Ted gave that for him. So we had 10 other people giving assessments of the Limits of Growth. And then we had the Voyageurs, which is a group concentrating on well-being. And finally, Mompella gave her final message to all of us. I think it bonded her with the Western Hemisphere, which is very good for all of us because we will now have more attention and our particular needs will be seen. And second of all, we will have this report in video form, a recording, which can be passed to all of you and put on your website. So thank you for listening to me.
Okay, I'm going to go over to Paul Beckwith. We're having a thunderstorm here, and I want to get our main computer turned off as quickly as I can. So after Paul, I'm going to go to a thank you from Jean Doherty, and then I'll see if there's time to come back to Mary Hegan. Don't be surprised if Jean has to drop off.
Yes. Okay, a quick question. Yeah, Jeff Rubin, he used to be the CIBC World Markets economist, and he's written a number of books since. And one of his books about, I think it's Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. He talks about carbon issues, carbon pricing, but he also talks about the soils in, parts of the Northern Ontario being very good soils. They're parts of, glacial Lake Iroquois, which was there for a while. So the sediments built up and the soils are quite good, but it's a bit too cold there to grow stuff now. So he figured about another degree rise in temperature, and that region, which is quite large, could become sort of a breadbasket and would make Canada, maybe a breadbasket of the world. Have you read any of his stuff? Or, do you have any comments on that possibility?
Well, I've read Jeff Rubin, but not about that particular opportunity. I just like one of the limitations of growing in the north is, of course, the season, like with light. Like you get a lot of light during the summertime, but the seasons are pretty short. So you have to have short season varieties, and often the soil is a limitation. But what you're saying is in this particular area, the soil is not a limitation, and there is opportunity there. That's good news.
Yeah, I'll try to find a link to the or take a photo of images of a couple pages in his book that pertain to that, and spread it around to the group.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we're going to go over to Jean Doherty for the thank you, and if we get time, we're going to come back to Mary Hegan.
Thank you. Somebody turned my video off, so I can't turn mine back on. So I'll just do this by. Thank you. Ralph, it's my pleasure and privilege to be able to thank you for your talk on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. We've been hearing an awful lot about agriculture as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So your particular talk is a really good example of the potential that agriculture produces for us as a possible solution to some of the problems that we are facing. So I would really like to thank you for giving us this new perspective for things. And I would also like to invite anyone who is here today or wanting to spread around the news about this particular talk. This will be posted on our website, canadiancore.com. So within the next few days, so you can certainly go and look up this particular talk at that time. We also ask that if you are interested in becoming a member of CACOR, you can also go to our website and find information about how to become a member. And we also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to look at all of the various talks that we have had in the past. As we said, 102 so far, and a vast majority of those are available on our website to be seen. So with that, again, I would like to thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Okay, Mary, are you there? Mary's not coming up immediately. Oh, here she is.
Myself back in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Whoa, have you got me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Ralph, looking at the slightly bigger picture, or let's say suburbia and cities in Ontario and Canada, people are really anxious to do their role for climate, and just as much as they're trying to figure out what a EV is in their life. At the slightly bigger picture, what is your sense and best use of land and knowledge? Should we be lobbying for big agriculture to continue working on the edges of cities, and or what percentage of growing food should be almost objectives, targets for more inner city living? People are really curious whether, if they go to all the effort to try to that, are they really being helpful to the planet?
Mm-hmm. Well, this reminds me of a story of a student in one of my classes who was telling me that they had a farm that was next to a city, and every time they hauled manure, all the people in the neighborhood complained, and they got lots of phone calls and emails, and it was distressing for everybody. So they decided that they would go around and get the email addresses of all the people who were around the edge of their farm. And they had several hundred emails, and they would let people know every time they were going to spread manure. And they said that we expect it's going to be on this day, and we think the wind is going to be in the appropriate direction, so it's not going to come your way on that day, and we're going to try and turn it under right away. And like, they were doing everything they could, and they felt like they were almost out of patience, and they were ready to move their farm. The neighbors responded splendidly, and they appreciated having the information ahead of time. And then this farm started changing their practices because people wanted to come to the farm and buy products, and they weren't growing the products. But when the people realized that there was a farm there and they had communication and a relationship, then the farm started responding to what the people wanted. So I'm doubtful that there should be legislation. And I know that there are a lot of large farmers, and I was a delegate for Peel, the region of Peel, when they were talking about paving over more farmland for housing. And I was a delegate saying, no, we should not do that. And in the same delegation, there was a farmer who lived in that region, who's a fairly large farmer. And he said, yeah, he said, I want to sell my land. He said, it's really hard to farm around here with big equipment, and people don't like my manure, and they won't let me drive on the roads, and they get impatient. So it could be that land, if we develop legislation, I guess I'm more a fan of the carrot, that makes it easy for farmers to interact with urban folks. the farmers who want to do that, and there are many, many small farmers and emerging farmers who would like to do that type of thing near a city, perhaps there could be legislation to make sure that they get access to land. Maybe the land in urban areas should be owned by the municipality and leased on renewable 10-year leases or something like that to young people who want to lease and meet certain criteria. There's a wonderful opportunity near Pickering where they were going to build an airport a few decades ago and they didn't, but that land is all owned by the federal government. And I could just imagine that the federal government saying, well, we want this land farmed. Here are the criteria that you must meet if you want to farm on this land. And I think it would be a tremendous research opportunity. And I talked to a few of the people in the federal government about how great this would be as a research opportunity. And let's just say they were less enthusiastic than I was, but I think there was a good opportunity there.
Thank you. Very helpful.
So Art, I know you had one question. If you want, you can squeeze it in now and then we can stop the recording.
Okay, just quickly, I got a bit of a background in the world of space and satellites that clearly very early on in man's conquest of space was the ability to have infrared scanning of the Earth's surface, and one could see multiple things at sea and on the land. One, of course, was the ability to identify plants, their species, the stage of their growth, and to do yield analysis. And I know that the Canadian Wheat Board has been involved in terms of making sure that markets were there and we weren't overselling, et cetera, et cetera. My question is, this technology clearly has matured quite a bit and it is used extensively, but how is this being used in the third world, or is it at all?
I know that there are some developing countries that are using it, but I don't have a lot of specific examples, but I think there is real potential there. It also has a lot of potential for monitoring, so that, like, for example, with cover crops and keeping soil covered in the off season, monitoring with satellites and making sure that they're the appropriate crops that are covering and providing incentive payments to farmers for doing that, whether in developing countries or here. I think there's some real opportunity there to use it in that way. But I'm sorry, I can't answer your question about how much that is used in the third world now.
Okay. And I guess with this, David, are you ready to close? All right.
Yeah, you bet.